From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Darryl Morris. It was a death which reverberated around the world. On the first day of the Iran war, Israel and American strikes took out the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Khamenei, one of the most evil people in history, is dead, says the president. This is not only justice for the people of Iran, but for all great Americans and those people from many countries throughout the world that have been killed or mutilated by Khamenei and his gang of bloodthirsty thugs.
In the aftermath, questions swirled about who would replace him.
There's always been much speculation over who the next supreme leader might be.
I have to ask you the big question on everyone's mind. Who is in charge in Iran right now?
And President Trump says he must play a role in picking the next leader of Iran as questions grow over the future of the country.
And then, on Sunday, an answer.
Mojtaba
Khamenei, the second son of Ali Khamenei, has been chosen as the new supreme leader of Iran, in a blow to President Trump.
The president dismissing the Ayatollah's son as an option and telling Axios that Khamenei's son is a lightweight. I have to be involved in the appointment, like with Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela. Khamenei's son is unacceptable to me. We want someone that will bring harmony and peace to Iran.
So, who is Mojtaba Khamenei, and what does his appointment mean for the future of the war in the Middle East? The story today: Iran selects a new supreme leader.
Well, I was in Iran before the January protests happened. It was after the 12-day war with Israel, but before the protests. So there was kind of an uneasy tension in the country.
That's Catherine Philp, the world affairs editor for The Times, who's been going to Iran for about 20 years. She was last there in November.
You could see that the regime was attempting to hold on to power. It was a country clearly quite shocked by what had happened with Israel. It was the first time Iranians had felt that tension with their neighbours explode in their own country.
We're recording this on the 10th day of the conflict, 10 days now after the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed by that US strike. Who's been in charge in Iran since then?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, in a sense, Khamenei, before he was killed, he was in charge in a kind of distant, nominal way, in the sense that he'd laid out a plan for how Iran was going to behave if it was attacked again. He had long set the red lines for the Islamic Republic, but he wasn't doing much in day-to-day terms. That had really fallen to a character called Ali Larijani, who is the Secretary of the Supreme National Council, which makes him the top security official in Iran. And he was really both in charge of preparing Iran for the potential of war, but also in charge of that horrendously brutal crackdown we saw on protesters that took place in January, when essentially the regime massacred the people in the streets in order to preserve the regime.
So why, Catherine, has it taken so long to announce a new supreme leader?
Well, first of all, we have to remember how this conflict began. There was a strike on the Supreme Leader's compound, which killed him and killed some of the people in the immediate ranks below him. So that's the starting point. Secondly, you have to get together an 88-member panel of clerics to make this decision, to tease it out. And this war having started with an airstrike on a leader's compound where exactly that kind of meeting was taking place, a meeting to organise for the war, everyone was well aware that that would happen again, or would likely happen again. And indeed it did. The Israelis twice hit places where they believed the Assembly of Experts was meeting. So you then have the fact that you've lost some of the potential candidates, or at least that's the suggestion of Donald Trump, that some of the people they were thinking of were actually killed in that strike. And then you have the fact that there would have been disagreements in the ranks and that people had to tease out within that group what their priorities were. So essentially, was security or were clerical credentials going to be more important? So Mojtaba Khamenei, although he is the son of Ayatollah Khamenei, he's not known for his clerical credentials. He is known for his security credentials. And so I think that one of the reasons it took a while was that the Revolutionary Guard were coming down hard on everyone, saying that this was their choice and they wanted to go in a security direction, because he's not just sort of slightly short of the scholarly qualifications he needs as his father was when he stepped up. He's a long way short of them. So it really does, it is a really marked contrast, and it shows that security is the most important thing.
And you allude, Catherine, to this quite complex position of the supreme leader, sort of clerical, theological credentials needed, also security and military responsibilities. Tell us more about this actual job.
Yeah, I mean, it's the everything job. You are essentially in absolute control of everything in Iran, should you choose to be. You have total control over the judiciary. You are the commander-in-the-chief of the armed forces and also the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, who's the Praetorian Guard of the Islamic Republic rather than the regular military. Your word is God's, essentially. And it can be in a religious sense too. You can issue fatwas, things like that. I think that is much less of a consideration in this appointment, but nonetheless, this is the job. And at this moment, the survival of the regime and the survival of the Islamic Republic is absolutely foremost. And so in that sense, his security credentials are what is needed at this point in time.
Okay, let's find out more about this person then who has landed this huge God-given role. Mojtaba Khamenei is the son, of course, of Ali Khamenei. Had you heard of Mojtaba before this weekend?
Yes, I had. One of the reasons being that his name came up in the WikiLeaks some 8 years ago, in which it was said that he was a kind of shadowy but very powerful character who appeared to be running his father's office, but was not known to most Iranians.
What more do we know about him and his story?
Well, the first thing really he did in his life after his high school education was to join the Revolutionary Guard and to fight with them in the Iran-Iraq War. And he was really young when he did that. He can't have been more than 18 if you look at the dates. And that essentially gave him a security background that indeed his father never had. He later goes on to study at the Qum Seminary, which is obviously a religious education, but again, stops short of the kind of education that his father and other clerics have got, because he really only completed what I think we would recognize as a bachelor's degree in his religious studies. Now, since then, he's not been someone who's been very visible in Iran, but he has been working in his father's office. He's very aware of everything that his father has done in the past and has wanted to do. He specifically, I think this is interesting for, what we're watching inside Iran right now. In 2009, when there were protests, anti-government rather than anti-regime, because they were carried out by reformist politicians who weren't trying to bring down the Islamic Republic, but who were strenuously objecting to what they saw as the fraudulent election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad as president. And so it was some of the candidates in that race who formed something called the Green Movement and brought a lot of people out onto the streets.
We want freedom! We want freedom! This is a country which, according to the government, just overwhelmingly re-elected its president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. But in the capital, Tehran, thousands of protesters differed vehemently.
And Mojtaba himself jumped into that and took control of the Basij and the Revolutionary Guard who were putting down those protests. The Basij are like a volunteer militia, very ideological. They work under the Revolutionary Guards, and they pretty brutally put down those protests. And most of those reformist politicians were either put in jail or under house arrest. And it really spelled the end of any mainstream opposition we've seen in Iran within the existing body politic. So I think that's quite a good illustration of how he would deal with any challenge to his rule from inside Iran.
And look, we've talked about his sort of religious credentials, his clerical credentials being a little bit weak. What do we know about what he believes?
We don't know much about what he believes, but we do know that he was very aware of what his father believes. He's clearly been chosen because of that, as well as because of who he is, but because of his intimate knowledge of how his father's office operated. He's a continuity candidate. The idea is to send a message of nothing's changed, we soldier on, the Islamic Republic, it continues despite the killing of the previous supreme leader. So I don't see any real likelihood of any changes in his thinking or beliefs from the kind of beliefs that his father held.
Just remind us what his father's belief system actually entailed.
That's a really interesting question, because not all of his father's activities, shall we say, entirely align with the stated belief systems of the revolution. I mean, he built up this incredibly strong military and has been involved in corruptly amassing billions over his lifetime. So that's quite hard to square with these, hugely devout beliefs. But really the essence of Khamenei's rule and that of the republic that he led was resistance, the idea of resistance to the West, to all things Western, America and Israel. His ideas were built on the notion of simply being oppositional. And he's not alone in this. There's other people in other parts of the world who define themselves by their enemies. But I think it's very safe to say that Khamenei almost exclusively defined himself as that by the end.
And I know this is a complicated question with multiple answers, probably. But what do the Iranian people think of Mojtaba Khamenei?
Well, his father was deeply unpopular at the time of his death, and I can't see that they would have any more reason to like him than they did his father. I think he's a fairly unknown quantity to most people in Iran. There would be a few bits of news that some people might know about him, mostly stuff that's been uncovered by foreign investigations and foreign journalists. Firstly, that appearance in the WikiLeaks files, but also several investigations, including one by Bloomberg, that's linked him to a lot of corrupt activity, laundering of his father's billions and managing to send them overseas through shell companies. So amassing money that really ought to belong to the Iranian people. But I think it's really important to say how out of touch the Islamic leadership has been with the Iranian people for a long, long time. It is the most secular country in the Middle East, and about 70% of the population identify as secular. Even from the moment of the Islamic Revolution itself, it didn't go the way a lot of people thought it was. There were a lot of people who were opposed to the monarchy, who were involved in sort of trade unions. They were leftists, they were Marxists and stuff. And women, a lot of women were involved. And they were immediately betrayed by the turn that the Islamic Revolution took and the way that it used this heavy-handed religiosity against its own people. So it's not his unpopularity as an individual that matters. It's his unpopularity as a leader and a motif of this regime. Mm. Don't forget, this is a regime that has very recently slaughtered possibly as many as 30,000 of its own people. I don't think we can overstate how traumatized and angry Iranians are about that.
Donald Trump has described Mojtaba Khamenei as a lightweight, so we sort of got a bit of a sense of how Donald Trump feels about this character already. But how will this appointment be being met in America and Israel?
Well, I think it'll just redouble their attempts to assassinate him. I mean, Donald Trump was possibly rather inarticulately explaining that this wasn't who he wanted to take charge. But to call Mojtaba a lightweight is very far from the reality. He's not a lightweight at all.
I'm Negah Angha, Formerly, I was a senior advisor at the U.S. Department of State and at the White House National Security Council under President Biden.
We've been learning about the new supreme leader of Iran, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the late Ali Khamenei, his second child. We've heard about his appointment being something of a sort of continuity in the regime. How would you describe the health and the strength of the regime this week?
Look, on one hand, the regime is clearly under extraordinary stress. Its, longtime leader has been killed. It's fighting an external war. The economy has been battered by years of sanctions and now by this conflict. But the security elite fractures haven't occurred. So the security apparatus, and when I say security apparatus, I mean the Revolutionary Guards, the intelligence services, the besieged networks, they all still appear to be intact and operational. There's been no defections. And that matters far more for regime survival than any sort of public sentiment that may be out there. So I think, in short, the system is really signaling continuity and defiance. And I think that is, quite frankly, disconcerting because it doesn't feel like this could end tomorrow. This feels like there's longevity to it.
That's really interesting. So as we try to consider the health of this regime, resilience is the way that you would describe it. How does that influence Iran's objectives in this conflict, do you think?
They're very clear about survival. The security apparatus has nothing to lose. They are at war on all fronts, and they haven't backed down. So on Saturday, the Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, came out and apologized to the Gulf countries.
I must apologize on my own behalf and behalf of Iran to the neighboring countries that were attacked by Iran. The Interim Leadership Council agreed yesterday that no more attacks will be made on neighboring countries and no missiles will be fired unless an attack on Iran originates from those countries.
And the IRGC made a fool of him and immediately targeted Gulf countries, and they continue to do so to civilian infrastructures within the Gulf. And so, they are surviving, and they are telling the world that they are going to survive and have nothing to lose, and are essentially, I don't even know if sometimes there's even a strategic view. It's more of just attack on all fronts and see what happens.
Trump says this conflict was, amongst other things, about regime change, and yet, as we speak right now, the supreme leader of Iran is somebody called Khamenei still. Where does that leave that objective?
The thing is escalation is still very possible where we are today because it comes from a bit of strategic mismatch. I think Washington may have hoped that the leadership decapitation and military pressure would have forced the regime to unravel or produce some sort of concessions. But Tehran's doctrine has historically been based on endurance rather than capitulation. And I think Iranian leaders believe that time often works in their favor, and they just assume the political cycle will shift in Washington. Markets are going to react to the instability, and external coalitions lose cohesion. Right now, like you see, many other Western capitals that are traditional allies of the United States have not joined in a proactive way like they've done in other conflicts and scenarios. The reality is that military pressure alone very rarely produces the outcome needed quickly, especially in a place that is as convoluted as Iran. And if the objective is something a little bit more narrower, like forcing a new deal, then the conflict may need a political off-ramp, but that doesn't exist right now. What President Trump may be thinking, or amongst his advisors, is whether or not Mojtaba could be a deal maker.
Okay, so let's just be clear on that then. On where this leaves Trump and the possibility of strikes or deal. What's your sort of hunch telling you? Now we know who the characters are in that story.
Mm-hmm.
Mojtaba Khamenei on one side, Donald Trump on the other. Strikes or deal?
I think they're going to try both. I think they continue to try both. I think the administration first needs to gauge, again, whether Mojtaba is going to be somebody they can make a deal with or not. And if they can't, they'll continue with, full force strikes and try to create some fissures between the security apparatus. Otherwise, if they feel like there's an appetite for a deal, I think the Trump administration will push hard for it.
We also know of Mojtaba Khamenei, his role in the Revolutionary Guards involved him in some very brutal crackdowns on protests during that period. And we also know that Donald Trump has stated as another objective, empowering the Iranian people to pursue an uprising. Where do you feel Mojtaba Khamenei, being supreme leader, leaves the prospect of an uprising?
The Iranian public is not monolithic, so half of it is going to be supportive of this regime, and they have, a vested interest in it, whether from business dealings or ideologically supportive of it. And then there's the other half of the Iranian population who is going to continue to voice their concerns, collectively go out and protest against all odds. The economic situation in Iran hasn't ameliorated. The same issue that they came out on the streets, the last days of December, early days of January, still exists. It is still extremely expensive to buy bread. We're not even talking meat. To buy bread, people aren't necessarily able to work in the same way. It's just complete havoc. And again, at the end of the day, those are the same concerns that exist. So there are going to be protesting for these basic needs. And what the Iranian regime knows how to do is a lot of propaganda. So they're going to keep pushing out information into the system. The internet is down, so it's not as if the Iranian public can, cross-check and learn a little bit more about what's happening. They're getting most of their information from inside the country. And essentially, it's showing these images of children being killed, the fires and the explosions happening inside the Capitol. So there's people will protest, but again, whether it's enough to, throw the regime off course, we'll have to see.
Negah, a penny for Benjamin Netanyahu's thoughts.
I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is going according to his plan and his objectives. Prime Minister Netanyahu's objectives in this fight against Iran is a bit of a different color than the U.S. administration's sort of intended objectives and goals. While the nuclear front is important, Israel has been very clear that the dismantling of Iran's ballistic missiles are incredibly important. But in addition to that, they have been seeking a regime change within Iran for quite some time, mainly because they are seeking to have a neighbor inside the Middle East that could one day be an ally, but that's not possible with this sort of Islamic regime, with the IRGC, the security apparatus around the Islamic regime. So when we observe some of the targeted attacks that Israel has taken the lead on, you see that they have targeted very specific facilities that are attached to either the IRGC military or police, and one by one sort of taking out the leadership that would get in the way of a potential regime change that would allow Israel and Iran to one day become allies in the region.
And so just to be clear on what the appointment of Mojtaba Khamenei means for Israel and, crucially, Netanyahu's objectives here. You mentioned about how he feels about nuclear and ballistic capabilities and, of course, the regime and its express intention of wanting to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. Mojtaba Khamenei doesn't change any of that for you and for Netanyahu.
No, he does not. He is cut from the same cloth. He is probably more ruthless than his father was. But no, going from one Khamenei to the next Khamenei is the same.
We were speaking to our World Affairs editor, Catherine Philp, earlier, who said that Mojtaba Khamenei's appointment will put an even bigger target on his back. Here you are, you're the supreme leader, congratulations and good luck. What are the chances of the US and Israel targeting him directly sooner rather than later?
I mean, that risk can't necessarily be dismissed, but I think it's complicated. Leadership decapitation can be tempting militarily because it disrupts the command structures, the command and control inside the country, but it also carries quite a bit of strategic risks. Potentially in this scenario, removing Mojtaba could potentially produce more radical successors, or it could fragment the command. And the other sort of component, too, is an optics question. I think, once a conflict is essentially perceived as an assassination campaign against another country's leadership, it really does strengthen inside the country more nationalistic sentiment, and it makes diplomacy essentially politically impossible.
Qatar's energy minister warned last week that a war that is protracted in the Middle East would bring down the economies of the world, energy prices going higher, product shortages. We are living with the effects of that kind of already. We're seeing some quite dramatic numbers, Negah, in oil prices and the sort of knock-on effects of Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz. How much do you think that is going to play a part in how long this war goes on? How these men at the top of these countries calculate just how long they can drag this out?
I think that's a great question. I mean, again, just to reflect back, the Strait of Hormuz is the single most important energy choke point in the world. Roughly 1/5 of global oil flows through it. Iran has historically used the threat of disrupting the Hormuz as a deterrent. So this is part of their playbook. It's rarely closed it outright. And the reason why they haven't closed the Strait of Hormuz in the past is because it also has a damage on Iran's own economy. But here we are today. I think, with Mojtaba's appointment, I think that's why you saw the market becoming even more nervous, because they see the rhetoric, the actions by the regime is becoming more and more aggressive. The market is not necessarily seeing that this conflict will have an immediate off-ramp, which means prices are going to soar even more. And I think the fear isn't just the war, it's the uncertainty around the energy flows. And when you have that much anxiety in the system, people are going to try to predict an increased cost to protect, future outliers. So I think going back to the United States, I do think, quite frankly, domestically, the prices will have an impact. It's quite high. It has been higher in the past, so I think there is still room, maybe a few days, maybe about a week or so, for President Trump to be able to work around this. But after some time and with increased prices, I think the American public will start voicing more and more concerns, and that will change sort of the calculus of trying to find an off-ramp because of the market influx and less so of maybe what's happening inside the country.
That was Negah Angha, former State Department and National Security Council advisor. And before that, you heard Catherine Philp, World Affairs editor for The Times. Today's producers were Micaela, Arneson and Sophie McNulty. The executive producer was Tim Walklate. Sound design and theme composition were by Mel Lassetto. I'm Darryl Morris. If you'd like to get in touch, it's thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.